Thank you, Charles, for the great presentation. It's been mind-blowing and a new concept and a new approach for many of the practices that we have seen here before, but not under that frame. The next speaker will be Sebastián Monsalve from Latitude, from Medellín. Welcome, Sebastián.
Hello everyone, my name is Sebastián Monsalve Gomez. I'm going to give my conference in Spanish. First of all, I would like to thank Harvard University as well as AFID and Luis Callejas for his kind invitation. My presentation is really very simple and very practical in the simple procedures in which we've been working. It's basically the work between architecture, landscapes, and the intervention in some of the infrastructure that we have been doing at a more of a conceptual manner. And with this we can actually define three very interesting points. It's these three case studies that I want to show you today that a little bit share the analysis in which we have been generating throughout the last 5 years. And what does it have to do? It has to do with the relationship with architecture and infrastructure through landscape. The three projects is water duct, yes, highways and airports. There's a very interesting thing we have to consider. Is the way in which we can actually relate in the different perspective, correct? In the river park, right? How can we do the scaling of it to really commit to the structure, the urban structures that are necessary for the continuation of mobility, and the same to say with those urban structures? How can we actually dialogue and actually construct a territory without necessarily destroying these infrastructures and really create a symbiotic kind of idea between these two? This is a project that I want to push, right? This is a project in which we actually worked in an idea project, and in Italy, where we had two water ducts. This is a mountain on the Mediterranean. We have two water ducts. This is type A, type B, and which you can see it has certain tunnels which begin to fragment all of the topography in that situation. On the type A is what had been existent from many years ago, right? We're talking about an infrastructure that's through bridges. We're talking about a bridge system that's around 25 kilometers. And this is kind of the idea of what I wanted to mention, to introduce the idea of the scope here. Okay, this was actually necessary through the connectivity of the nation per se, yes? And this is what had started to, as a petition to really better the times of communication between Sicilia and the other states. The competition actually said that we had to stipulate a situation where we can occupy this structure because of all of the optimization of all of the viability, okay? With the mayor's office. So basically what did we have to do? As a project, we actually created a full system of landscapes on top of that, the roads that have become now abandoned, and we converted it into some sort of a linear park. What we did is consolidate the tunnels. All of the land that we would actually take out of the tunnels, we would displace it for the 25 kilometers, and we actually constructed different kinds of topography, and it would give very, very significant elements of landscape to each one of those. The production for food, biomass, or complementary elements. The most interesting thing when we did this development is we started to understand, to be able to construct a very extend territory. We're talking about 25 kilometers long. There was some intentions that started giving us an idea, was what kind of typological situations we would have to do, what kind of ideas that we can actually do. That in the construction, the sequential construction of each one of these would allow to create this kind of 25 kilometer long landscape. This is more of a picture. The interesting part here is that what we learned the most was that first question: how can we relate between infrastructure and nature? And from there, how can we construct a project of this magnitude? So the second point, or the second line of infrastructure that we want to see, is for the roadways, for the construction of the airport. This is a competition in which we had a recognition of honor in 2012, and this was the reconversion of a park for the air park of Carlota, where we tried to convert it into the metropolitan park. And this is something I want to push again, because it's something similar to what happened today here in the river park, is when we look at as a roadway of 25 kilometers to an infrastructure that is about 1 kilometer wide for 3 kilometers long. And here, as you can see, this is Caracas. This is the La Villa Center. What this does is create a large island of infrastructure that is not accessible. It's impossible to cross, and it's completely disattached from all of the complementary social measures. And what does this teach us? It taught us something actually quite interesting. It's that all of these ships of infrastructure they should not only be being developed because of its environment, right? But it's something, these are considered elements that actually repotentialize the communication between all of a territorial system. But to go far beyond that, it can actually have repercussions in the urban infrastructure as well. What does this allow, as at the city level or at the territorial level, that a building of a specific infrastructure can begin to be part of the territorial infrastructure? And in the terminology of the creation of what the river park in Medellín stands for, when we start to think about the transference of each one of those landscapes, this was our proposal. This is the La Villa, this is the airport. Take into account that we have to understand that the airport is an island that is completely covered, that all of the grass that is created have to be very controlled to permit the landing of each one of the planes. And there is an infrastructure that is set up for the landing strip, which is around 3 kilometers. Our big question was, when we actually started thinking about it as an island, is how to create a landscape, such a large landscape, to be able to achieve, to quantify the scaling of each one of these landscapes, to really convert it into what we always saw and what we always believed it could be inside of the urban planning. What were we talking about? Just taking from vast lands to demonstrate the quantification. All of this allows that the project is not so real for its construction. To the construction at the scale in which we were planning, correct? When we started dropping down the scale, lowering the scale, you can see the La Villa, you can see the Carlota. What we exactly wanted was to really generate, with all of the ecological connections of Caracas, a continuation between this biological epicenter to this lower one, which could be the Carlota. What we did was we transferred all of the landscapes from the La Villa. To be able to do this, what we proposed is to create these urban situations to really lower the necessity of these situations. This is something that becomes very fundamental. If it's easier to construct these dimensions, it's possible to create a 3 kilometer, 1 kilometer wide structure. This was one of the elements that really allowed us to develop the design of the park. Here you see the runway, that's something existent, where we should do very specific changes for the cultural activities. But when we start talking about the landscape around it, this is what actually allows us, each one of these landscape positions allows us to create that idea through all of the signalization. And this is exactly what the project is expressing. It was the only way to construct in this property, is to start off from that sequence and that model of work. What I just showed you, we're going to be moving on from the roadways or high roadways to the airport. Take into account that the airport is a runway of 3 kilometers, and it has a lot of necessary things for the territorial construction and for the human necessity. And here we're seeing the necessity of the infrastructure to the different highways, which is part of the Parque del Rio project. This is a project in which we were involved in 2013. We were the winners, actually. And at the moment, the project is being executed, okay? This is something very dramatic. This is the reality of the topography of today. What we see here today is the river Ura. It's a constitution of 100 kilometers, has a couple of incidents, not just geographical, but also territorial in terms to the kind of geographic that we are located in, that really conditions and really creates a real reality of an adequate measure in which we have been adequating the territory to fit everybody in. This actually gives us something very strong that really limits the territorial growth. The river here is a landmark, I would have to say, which is where the main roads of the city are actually constructed, that are on parallel to each one of the rivers. And then we have a situation that starts to put together the region and the nation. Take into account we don't have a lot of spaces in where to put these new spaces. This project actually is being created from a question. Starts as a system of a mobility system. The river park actually starts as a mobility, as a necessity that we outlined as a park next to the river. It's kind of the bettering or the completion of this mobility system of the city. This river here you can see at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. Here we can see another picture at mid 20th century. Through the planning, we had seen that the planning that on by the river there was going to be the main roads of the city. When we get to the picture of the present, this is exactly what happens. The river turns into a canal, and there are some roads that go parallel to the river, to the whole river itself. And there's actually a constellation to the idea of a mobility center. Take into account that we have a way of 17 kilometers of roadways. From a territorial standpoint, which was a river that actually was fed by all of the mountains and another one that fed a very diverse ecological system, now is converted into more of a scar that divides the territory in one. And this is like the beginning of the river project. And the idea of this river park is to try to put together this whole system of mobility from northern part of the city, and to really give a betterment to the connectivity of all the region itself. And what that happens with these infrastructures is that we don't necessarily see it, but I would say that the contest, you did have the opportunity to see it, and I think that a lot of the participants actually had the opportunity to show different perspectives of each one of their proposals for the river. This is something that we invented, or didn't invent per se, but we actually talked with all of the people we work with. This is the definition of how we can actually implement the river park system with the other infrastructures that are close by. Here is the Cuenca of San Miguel, which is the spring of where the river starts, and here you can see the stain of where the construction in Medellín has happened. Has actually limited all of the connections of the valley. And what happens in the project from a general point of view or conceptual is to really use that infrastructure to really attach each one of the ecosystems and really give a link to all of those by using the river. In general, the project, through the construction of these landscapes to working with these transversal creeks, what we actually look for is the potential. Whenever they're creating, what we're actually looking for a way of consolidating and implementing a system of landscape that can actually be definite and perpetual for the ecological development of the river. And this is what the project actually defined. This is what we actually set up, is the idea of working with native species to really consolidate the territory itself. Here we can see the definition of what the infrastructure for the liberation of the ground. So the roadways are actually underground, and the parks are on top. This is a very key part of the project. An interesting point from after showing you what we just seen is to really understand what we actually had proposed. It's the work that we had between creating a bond between infrastructure and the ecosystems, correct? This is what we propose in a section where we have a structural element, a 35-meter section. We're talking about a column of two that really allows us to support a soil crust about 1.5 meters of soil, and we can structure all of these situations where we can have a walkway that is civic and these kind of things, and we can actually relate it with each one of the schemes of the other projects in the city. So it's the idea to see how this section can actually be replicable, and how by replicating it, this could actually allow us to really create a new scenery of the city. And some of the doubts that some of these projects might have, especially with a lot of the social and political relationships, and a lot of times regarding their economic standpoint of the construction of all of this, what we see is how a typical element can be replicated and actually create a new country that is quite extensive. To this point, this is from what we were trying to push. We actually were able to come up with a definition that was very similar. What we're going to show you in a minute is what most interests you, and it's the massive question that we've been working on for so long. It's how we can actually construct the reality of a landscape, of a typical landscape that we can actually replicate, to be able to generate a real perspective on a long-term basis. To be able to realize these kinds of things, we actually started thinking about two different systems for landscape, which goes to the different necessities that we outlined during the contest. From technical aspects, some possible aspects, yes, and from there, from both of the schemes, we created the spaces, right? The first step, what actually is sold, is that from the moment, from the longitudinal section, where we can actually liberate these new sections of landscape, we can actually set up what kind of biological entities we have to set there, what kind of situations should be set up in each one of those spaces to really create these ecological runways, correct? So what we actually do is try to create the border of the river. We create the land or the species of plants that should be there, and all of the species that could be constructed on the border of the city. As you can see here, this actually defines an interrelation scheme, or we can see some of the species in which are the most important for us and which are the most associated to the Carlota. So this is our scheme for landscaping, correct? And this is what really creates the real biodiversity which are really found in our territory, and associating them with other different kinds of species would correlate the best. Take into account to measure the idea of height, of density, and how they can actually generate different models of landscaping and really work together. And this is exactly what I wanted to mention, which is the idea of the Carlota, to really understand how these real models can be quantifiable, how we can actually mix between them to get better results. Here we can see the model of a forest. This is another border at the border of the river. And if you can see, the border of the river actually creates these openings to be able to focus each one of the landscapes into this urban territory. And here we can see something very interesting about the project, how you can see a very small element, how it can be replicated throughout the whole system. What do we do in this situation? We associate the architectural circumstances, create these different spaces, water spaces, configuration of transversal bridges, and on the border of the river to really create an alignment between nature and nature and architecture. To finish up, I would like to say this is the main element that we have been finding ourselves in the last 3 years. How can we construct a master plan and define the reality of a urban structure of 17 kilometers for it to be something practical and really visible? How can we, from a very small standpoint, create very large territories? It's to really how to replicate these associative methodologies to really reach. How can we actually continue to translate them into better infrastructure? And we mean that the infrastructures are very necessary and they make an important part of the life of what this city is. And really understand how we can configure all of these things in the contextualization of a territory to really work with having a way of kind of connecting these territories and taking the environment in nature. So it turns from being a fight between them into kind of a project where they work together.